Hey everyone, today we're going to go over a skill set that I think anyone who owns a studio, whether it's a super small home studio or a super big professional studio, this is a skill set that absolutely everyone should have. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, I'm Cole Caparoon. Thank you for stopping by for another video. I've been sitting here soldering for days now. I'm making custom length microphone cables for every single speaker and custom length power cables, a whole wiring harness, a power wiring harness for the entire Atmos rig. And it just occurred to me that I've never done a video on soldering, and there's been lots of people, I've shown soldering in many videos, but there's been lots of people that have been like, I wish I knew how to do this. I can't solder. So today, let's try to fix that. Now we're gonna jump down and I'm gonna show you my process and what I use, how I do it. And then after that, we're gonna discuss some more tips and some more tricks to help you better solder and get more consistent soldering, what types of materials to use, etc. So let's jump into it. Okay, so let's first go over the tools. Now, the first thing you're gonna need is a good soldering iron, not just a pen soldering iron. I mean, if you're doing just one or two cables, sure, but get yourself a good soldering iron. This is the one that I'm using. I've had this absolutely forever. That's a good investment to have. And you can see where I am soldering. I solder very hot. So this is about 800 degrees is the tip. The reason why you want a good soldering iron is because it's able to keep the soldering iron tip a consistent temperature much better. When you start touching the tip to the metal soaks all the heat away from the tip of the soldering iron, and the better soldering iron you have, the more consistent it's gonna keep that temperature, and that's really important. You also want a sponge, wet sponge to clean your tip. There's a few different ways to do that, but I like the wet sponge thing. First thing you're gonna do is get your cable ends. There are two ends, there's male and female. This being the female side, and this being the male side. Then you want to measure your cable out, figure out exactly how long the cable is that you're making, and the very first thing that you do before you do anything else is you take this piece right here that screws on the end when you're done soldering, and you put it on. That's the very first thing. And you're gonna forget that a bunch of times, but that's the very most important thing. Okay, let's go over tools real quick. Soldering iron, you obviously need some solder. Next up, I really like one of these little gadget arm things. I don't even know what to call this. You can get these at like a hobby store, like a Hobby Lobby or whatever. And this really helps because you can pinch, you'll see, you can pinch your cables and your parts in here and hold them while you're soldering. Next up, you need a pair of side snips. Next up, you need a good pair of wire strippers. And then this is kind of my own thing. I don't see people talk about this too much. A miniature pair of needle nose pliers makes all the difference in the world. Next up, this is maybe my old school way of doing it because I've been doing this for a long time. I like using a razor blade. And I'll show you what that's for. I know that you can get other wire strippers, but I like using a razor blade for taking this insulation off of the wire, because if I don't, then I need two different pair of wire strippers, and like I've just been doing it that way for a long time, so that's how I'm gonna keep doing it. And then for this particular wire, because this is a twin pair wire with a braided shield that I'm using here, I use this punch to get the braid apart, and we'll go over all that. So first thing you're gonna do is take somewhere about an inch and a quarter, and whether you're using wire strippers or this razor blade method, you're gonna score that so that way it's all the way around and we've got it separated. And then what I do is make a slit this way, and then you can literally just peel that apart and it comes right off. So next up, because this is a braided cable, this takes a little bit of extra time. A lot of mic cables, the shielding is just wrapped around and you just peel it back, but because this is braided, this takes a little bit of time. So let me get that all worked out here. So I take my punch and I literally just separate the wires here, and I just pull them. And basically you just want to unbraid this back far enough to start stripping the wires that are inside and to start soldering stuff together. So then once you've got that pulled back far enough, then the move is to just grab it, pull it tight, and twist it tight. You want to twist this so that way it's a nice tight wind. like so. And then we're gonna take all this, every cable has some sort of cotton or some sort of string or something else to shield the shielding from the actual wires. Take our side snips and we just snip, cut that off. Now, because this is twin pair, that means we've got 2 and 2. And it's common to make mic cables this way. Commercial companies make mic cables this way as well. So we're gonna treat this like 1 wire and 1 wire. And if you have just a 3-lead mic cable, then you would do just the same thing. Just, you wouldn't put these together because you only have 3 to begin with. So wire strippers, you're gonna strip, you know, somewhere around 3/16 of an inch, something like that, off of each one of these. You want to strip just a little bit less than you think you need, because when we go to tin these wires with solder, then the coating on the wire usually melts back a little ways. Okay, so then in this particular instance, then we're going to twist these pairs together real tight, all the way out to the edge, and again all the way out to the edge. Now this is where this thing starts becoming handy, because you can literally just hold everything in here, and that is awesome. So next up, we got to tin these wires. So you take your solder, you take your soldering iron, you clean the tip first. Make sure the tip looks nice and clean and shiny. And then what you always want to do when you're soldering is you always want to heat the part and then feed solder into the soldering tip and the part simultaneously. So solder iron on the wire, put a dab of solder on the tip itself. That'll help start the actual soldering process, and then you melt solder into the wire like that. Heat the wire, a little bit of dab of solder, and then solder into the wire. Heat the wire, dab of solder, solder into the wire. And that's called tinning. So now, these are not gonna come apart anymore. These are permanently like this. So the next thing we're gonna do is we wanna trim these, because they get a little wispy at the end. So I like trimming them so they're a little bit more square. Take our side snips, put all the wires together so that way we can snip them the exact same length, and like that. That way they're all exactly the same length. Now next up, we're gonna take our part here. Now, so this is the female end of the mic cable, and you can see they have these little troughs for the wires to go into. So we need to tin these. We need to fill these with solder first. Now, more important than even the wires is when you're soldering this, again, this is the genius of this thing, is it just sits there and holds it. You wanna heat the part, the metal, and then feed solder into it. You never just glob the solder on the iron. You heat the part and then feed solder into it. Now, the reason why I solder pretty hot is because it starts, as soon as you start heating this, it starts transferring heat through the part. And I wanna be able to get this solder on and done, get the iron back off the part before it heats it up all the way through and has a chance of melting all this. So that's why I personally solder hot, so that way I can solder fast and it saves parts. So we heat the part, dab of solder, and then we fill that trough with solder. Whoop. I find on these, if I angle it down a little bit, it kind of helps keep the solder at the tip. Let's just touch that one back up, make sure solder's down at the end, yep. And then we do this one, heat the part, fill it with solder. A little bit more in there. Okay, now the very next thing to do is you want to identify which pins you're using. Now, it doesn't really matter which you use. The ground is always on pin 1, but it doesn't really matter which one of these you use. What matters is that every cable that you solder is soldered exactly the same way, and most importantly, that the colors in the wire and the pins match on both sides. You want pin 1 on both sides being ground, pin 2 on both sides being blue, pin 3 on both sides being white, or whatever color you decide. So they're marked right here on the front. Pin 1 is closest to me. So we're gonna go ahead. So again, when we're soldering now, we're gonna heat the part and then stick the wire in the melted solder. And then just hold it real still while it cools. Now here is where the needle nose come in handy. You grab these wires like this, and you can kind of force it in like a general approximation of where it's going to go. And then we heat the part. And then wire goes in the part, and then let it cool. Same thing right here. We're going to bend this just a little bit, get it close, heat the part, and then solder, and then the wire gets pushed in the solder, and let it cool. And then you're going to take this little grommet, put it on right here, and then this is going to go right on here. And then we're going to pull up the end that we pushed on earlier and screw it in. That is how you make your own mic cables, right there. Okay, now some tips and tricks on soldering. The first tip is to use, you want to use quality connectors. Now, I know this goes without saying for a lot of stuff, but there's so many different companies that make different XLR connectors, TRS connectors, guitar cable connectors, etc., that you want to make sure that you use a good one, because there's a lot of crappy ones, and the crappy ones are really hard to solder on, and they're unreliable. So to me, that means Switchcraft or Neutrik. Those are the only two that I will use no matter what. Now, I'll put a link down below to some bulk wire that I recommend, and to different Switchcraft and Neutrik ends, connectors that you can solder on to make whatever kind of cable that you want. Those links go to Sweetwater. Sweetwater is sponsoring this video, and I think a lot of people don't realize that you can get a lot of parts from Sweetwater too. So I buy bulk cable, and I buy ends. All these ends that I've gotten here for this whole project, they all came from Sweetwater. So, and anytime you guys need any piece of musical gear, even if it's not cable related, you can jump on any one of my videos, click on any one of the links in the description below, and once you're on the site, you can purchase anything you need. And when you use those links, it goes a long ways to help support me and help me keep making content just like this. So thank you, Sweetwater, for supporting the channel, and thanks to you guys for using those links and for supporting Sweetwater, who supports me. And I really, really appreciate it anytime you guys need anything. Okay, now I tried to make this clear in the video, but I probably could have done a better job because I was actually focusing on soldering. The important thing with soldering is that you always heat the part first. You heat the part, and then you feed solder into the part and the tip of the soldering iron simultaneously. If you're just putting solder on the tip of the iron and you're not heating the part, you will get cold solder joints. And that is the #1 failure of soldering, is cold solder joints. So always heat the part, whether that's the wire or the connector or the circuit board or whatever you're soldering, heat the part and then feed the solder into the part and the tip simultaneously. Now, the next tip for me personally, and this is partially because I've been soldering for a long time, I solder pretty hot. I have my iron set at 800 degrees Fahrenheit. And I do that because when you put your soldering iron on a part, whether it's a wire or a circuit board or a connector, as soon as you touch that iron to that part, heat begins traveling down that part. And what you want to do is you want to heat the entire part up the least amount that you possibly can, especially when you're soldering on circuit boards. This is really important. So if you're proficient with soldering and you run your soldering iron a little bit hotter, then that means you can heat up just the area of the part that needs the solder very quickly, so you can get your soldering iron on the part, do your soldering, get your soldering iron off the part very quickly, which means less heat will travel through the entire part, which means you'll have less potential for damaging the part, whether it's an XLR connector or it's really important on circuit boards. So I solder hotter than most people for this very reason, so I can do it quickly and not have that heat travel nearly as much. Now, the next tip, you want to use flux core solder, but I personally like fairly thin solder. Like this is a very fine solder. I wish I could see what it was. I've had this roll forever, but I literally can't tell. But I use smaller diameter solder. And the reason for this is because it gives me more control over how much solder I'm feeding into a part. A lot of solder is thicker than this, and you don't have as much control. You just touch it and you may have too much solder. This isn't as big of a deal when you're soldering cables together, especially AC cables, power cables. But really when you're getting into circuit board stuff, this is a big deal. And so I like this thinner solder so that way I have more control over how much solder goes into the part. Now the next thing is to use a quality soldering iron. I mentioned this before, but I want to expand on this. If you buy just a cheap, pencil style soldering iron off of Amazon or whatever, the issue with those, the ones that just plug straight into the wall, the issue with those is they can't keep the tip of the soldering iron at a consistent temperature because they're just not powerful enough. What this means is you end up really increasing the chances that you overheat the part that you're soldering on, because as soon as you touch that soldering iron tip to the part begins sucking heat away from the tip of the soldering iron. And if the soldering iron can't maintain that temperature, that means you have to keep the tip of the iron on the part significantly longer before you can start soldering, which means that heat is going to travel through that part significantly more, increasing your potential for damage. Now, I know you can pick up cheap soldering irons for 20 or 30 bucks off of Amazon, but if you can, spend a little bit more. I've got this Weller. This is a WES51. I've bought this soldering iron 15 years ago, 16 years ago at this point, and it's an investment. It's a tool that I always have around. I've used it countless times throughout the past 15 or 16 years. So spend a little bit more money, get yourself a decent soldering iron. I highly recommend the Wellers. Any sort of these station soldering irons where you've got the actual station, highly recommended, especially the Wellers. Great brand. If you made it this far into the video and you haven't subscribed yet, I feel like I've probably earned your subscription. So if you found this useful, hit the subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, drop me a comment, share with your friends if you did find it useful. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys on the next video. Peace.